Which young Falcon has the most breakout potential between Clark Phillips, Richie Grant, DeMarcco Hellams, and Zach Harrison?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. I've been covering the Falcons basically since like 06 is really where I start the count. Formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod that makes it your first listen or first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are finishing at this point, at least, for the time being. We'll see, if we continue this conversation next week. But we have some other things on deck for you next week. Our conversation about the potential breakout players. And we've talked a lot about how there are like 10 plus guys on defense that are, on rookie contracts, second, third, fourth year players, as well as rookies that, have the Falcons are kind of hoping some of those guys will step up this year as they're being asked to play prominent roles. And basically the way I termed it was they're throwing 10 guys at the wall, so to speak. And a couple of them will stick, and we'll see who they're going to stick. And, 3 of those 10, at least by my count, are the rookie D linemen that they took, Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, and Brandon Dorless, leaving 7 other guys. And we've already talked about 2 of them, right? Or 3 of them, Arnold Bichetti and Troy Andersen. And so we're talking about the 4 of the remaining 5, I guess. I'm blanking on who that last person is. But we're talking about Richie Grant, DeMarcco Hellams, Clark Phillips, and Zach Harrison on today's episode. I'm trying to think who. It'll come to me later in the episode. But one point on Troy Andersen before we start the conversation talking about Clark Phillips and his potential to break out as a Falcons number 2 corner this year. One thing I did not bring up in that previous episode where we talked about Troy Andersen and the value that he brings, the fact that he can be a coverage player, he can be a plus asset in terms of the pass rush, but also he'll be an important piece in certain matchups where the Falcons need someone to spy the quarterback. That was a big issue last year where the Falcons did not have anybody who was athletic enough to spy all these mobile quarterbacks that they face this year. And, the schedule doesn't really have too many of those guys. You got like Jalen Hurts, you got Jaden Daniels. We'll see who the Steelers are starting week 1 between Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. But obviously, I think you're more concerned about Justin Fields at this point in Russell Wilson's career than you are Russell Wilson's mobility. But like those guys killed the Falcons last year. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that you didn't have a linebacker or a safety that you could trust as that spy. And Troy Andersen has that sort of athleticism. So, reason number 18 why Troy Andersen is an important piece for this Falcons defense, especially in their ability to match up against certain offenses. But that aside, let's talk a little bit more about Clark Phillips. And we've talked before about Clark Phillips and the ongoing battle at that CB2 spot opposite AJ Terrell. And it seems like it's going to be a battle between him and Mike Hughes as the front runners. We'll see whether or not Antonio Hamilton and Kevin King, 2 veteran players, can make it a 3 or 4-way competition later this summer. Now, I've gone on record saying that I think Mike Hughes is probably the front runner to be the week 1 starter. I'm not that confident that Mike Hughes will be the week 18 starter because, I don't have that high opinion of Mike Hughes to be able to hold down a starting spot for an entire season. So we'll probably see Clark Phillips at some point, even if he isn't necessarily the week 1 starter. I think one of the things that gets a lot of people excited about Clark Phillips this year and his potential breakout potential is that this scheme is going to be a lot better suited for his skill set. The Ryan Nielsen scheme from last year was much more wanted to be a press man type of scheme, and they couldn't really play that way once Jeff Okudah got hurt. And that skill set is never really going to be Clark Phillips' skill set. He's much better as an off-zone corner. He's a smart, heady player, plays with good awareness. He's the type of guy that loves to play off coverage, jump some of those underneath and intermediate throws. That's how he got a lot of his interceptions at Utah. Based off my film study last year, pretty much all of his interceptions that I charted in multiple games were him just jumping throws like that. And he's very good at that. And that will be something that he'll get a greater opportunity to do in this Raheem Morris scheme, given their propensity to play a lot more off zone coverage. And, the challenge that's going to be faced with Clark Phillips in that sort of role, despite, being a plus coverage guy in that role, the questions are going to be surrounding his ability in run support, right? That's where most of my concerns with Clark Phillips come. The lack of size, the short arms or whatever. I did, when he spoke to the media earlier this offseason, he did look a little bigger in the upper body. Again, just looked like he bulked up a little bit. Maybe that will help compensate from the short arms that he has. That we've heard Raheem Morris talk about this and why the team values length in the various draft picks is because it helps with wrapping up. You're able to get your arms around, whoever you're trying to tackle, whether that's a 180-pound wide receiver or a 260-pound tight end. It's easier to do that when you have longer arms, and that's the challenge for Clark Phillips. He's never going to be a great wrap tackler because of those short arms. But I think with the added bulk, if, let's say he's like 188, 192, somewhere in that range, like he can just kind of use simple physics to help aid him be a better tackler. Force equals mass times acceleration. And so with increased mass and being able to accelerate, he can just kind of be that missile that can kind of chop down guys' legs, and that's going to be how he gets guys on the ground. That isn't the most reliable way to tackle, especially in the NFL, because you have some really high caliber wide receivers that will be able to, break those sort of tackles and whatnot with their contact balance and whatnot. But it is at least a step in the right direction. So we'll see if Clark Phillips can improve in terms of his run supportability. And I know a lot of people are like, why do we care about run supportability? Shouldn't the Falcons, the number 2 corner, be the best coverage guy? And it's like, sure, yes, if all things are equal, but all things aren't equal. Right. The Falcons are going to play a bend but don't break style of defense with a lot of zone defense under Raheem Morris. What zone defense does means is it's going to concede a lot of short completions, easy completions, with the idea that we're going to rally to the football and limit those gains. And it's going to be that bend but don't break style. We'll concede 4 or 5 yards, but we'll not give up the big play. And in order for that style of defense to work, you have to be able to tackle, especially at the cornerback position, because, you'll concede that 5-yard completion. And if you don't make the tackle, that 5-yard completion turns into a 10-yard gain and a 15-yard gain. And that kind of breaks the style of defense. But we'll see if that winds up being the difference. And I think that's why I think Mike Hughes has the edge, because Mike Hughes, to me, is a much better tackler than Clark Phillips. I credited Clark Phillips with missing 5 tackles just in coverage. I didn't always consistently chart, how many missed tackles in run defense. So Clark Phillips had 5 missed tackles in coverage last year. Mike Hughes had 0. Now I know Pro Football Focus credited Hughes with 5 total missed tackles last year and Phillips with 6. And again, I think those 5 from Mike Hughes were primarily run defensive plays where, like, he would break it, a running back would, run him over or something like that. I know there was one on a toss play to Alvin Kamara in that Week 12 game that he missed a tackle on. But the other interesting thing is, going back to a conversation we had with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters last week, talking about how the prevalence of cover 3. I went back through all my defensive charting, looking at how, several of these players, we'll talk more about DeMarcco, Hellams, and Richie Grant later in the episode, but I wanted to see how these guys fared when I charted them as targeted in cover 3. And actually, Mike Hughes was actually more effective in cover 3 when targeted. He only gave up 3 successful plays on 7 targets, which is a success rate of 43%, which is solid. Phillips was 5 for 9, so he gave up a success rate of 56%, which is less than ideal in that regard. So we'll see if that can improve for Clark Phillips. I think ultimately, if they're close in coverage, then I think that's where the run support stuff matters a little bit more. And right, even though I know Clark Phillips, at least theoretically, should be a much better coverage player than Mike Hughes, we haven't quite seen it yet, at least, based off of the cover 3 stuff. Now, Phillips and other coverages was much more effective than Mike Hughes. But when we talk about the breakout potential of Clark Phillips, I've been vocal on this podcast basically since we drafted him that I'm not as high on Clark Phillips' ceiling as a clever corner, and so I remain skeptical on him, which contributes to why I'm not necessarily pushing for the team to start Mike Hughes, but it is one of those things where I do think that's probably the direction we're going to go. And it's like when what is a breakout year for Clark Phillips, and that's the sort of definition you ask, and for me that is, if he plays well enough this year that we go into 2025 with him as the uncontested starter opposite AJ Terrell, right? And I don't think the odds are particularly high that he's going to do that as an outside corner. I think the odds might be higher if he as a nickel corner, but it does at least seem for the time being that Alford is far and away the front runner to be the Falcons starting nickel corner this year. And I think he deserves that. I think Alford has consistently played well when he's gotten opportunities over the last 2 years in that role. So there's, we're at a point where it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it is a long season and you never know what's going to happen. Injuries, all that stuff, poor play, whatever, charted Alford in cover 3 and it wasn't particularly good last year. Gave up a 71% success rate on 7 targets in 2023. Now, he only gave up a 25% success rate on 8 targets in 2022. So overall, his success rate against when targeted in cover 3 was 47% over the last 2 years. So that's a good number, but last year wasn't great. And a lot of the guys cover 3 numbers last year wasn't great because that was based off my charting, like the Falcons' second least effective coverage, other than I think maybe cover 6. Maybe, but so they weren't a great cover 3 defense. They were much better playing cover 3 in 2022 when that was kind of what they specialized in under Dean Pease that particular year. So we'll see if we can get them back to playing at that level in the cover 3 in 2024 with Raheem Morris defense than what we saw last year. So in reality, I see, regardless of who winds up winning the number 2 corner spot opposite AJ Terrell, I kind of see, whether it's Hughes, whether it's Phillips, whether it's somebody else, I kind of see all of these guys as like bridge starters. Like they're good enough to get through this season, and then next year we'll be talking for like the 4th off season in a row. Like, are the Falcons going to use a 1st round pick on a corner? Like, we're going to have that conversation again. We've been having that conversation pretty consistently since 2021. I mean, there was some early Patrick Surtain buzz, if I recall, at that point that year, but sort of more in earnest in 2022, definitely. So it would be at least, three drafts leading up to this past draft, and next year we'll make 4. So we'll see how that goes. We'll continue today's conversation looking elsewhere in the secondary, talking about the potential position battle for that second safety between Richie Grant and DeMarcco Hellams, and talking about the cover 3. One of those guys seems like a great fit for the cover 3, and does that leave, in this case, Richie Grant sort of out on the outside looking in this potential competition? We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you that passion, drive, and patience, it is the winning formula for winning championships, and it's also going to be that winning formula that's going to keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle, level it up to peak performance, and whether you're looking for superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more, whether you're into speed, style, or power, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Guys, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, the free 24/7 sports streaming channel. Program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. And if you're looking for the biggest stories, at least locally here in the state of Georgia, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's free streaming channel on YouTube, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, the question is, are we going to get a competition at safety? Right? Like, there hasn't been, usually this time of off season, it's questionable because like it's OTAs and there's no competition, right? At this point in time, it's just everybody's trying to learn the new defense and all that stuff. It's learning time, not competing time. So we haven't really heard a lot of buzz up to the point that there's an open competition for the safety spot. But I think the assumption all along is, given that, Richie Grant got benched at the end of last season and DeMarcco Hellams kind of took over as a starter, that, the Falcons will have an open competition at that safety spot. But at the same time, at least based off of the quotes, I haven't heard too many of the coaches sing the praises of DeMarcco Hellams. I've seen, his teammates sing the praises of him. But it sounds like, at least most of the coaches' quotes seem to suggest that it's Richie Grant's job to lose. So we'll see if that is the case once training camp kicks off in 6-7 weeks or whenever that is. But this is going to be interesting competition, because the expectation, going back to the conversation we had with Cody Alexander match quarters last week, is that the Falcons going to play a lot of cover 3. And I think this is a great opportunity for DeMarcco Hellams, because we talked about this when we drafted DeMarcco Hellams. Like, he's kind of the perfect cover 3 strong safety that is not that effective in deep coverage due to limited speed and range and instincts, but is much more effective as that hook curl defender that you typically want in a strong safety in the cover 3, and especially when you're rotating from deep, like Cody suggested on the podcast, where the Rams defense under Raheem and presumably the Falcons defense under Jimmy Lake. We got to make that clarity that, Raheem Morris is not calling the defense, but we're expecting that it's going to be a very similar scheme with minor differences, that you're going to present pre-snap 2 high looks and then rotate into cover 3 looks. And that's going to often require that strong safety to be that hook curl defender that's kind of defending that middle seam area of the defense. And I think that's better suited for DeMarcco Hellams in terms of a coverage potential, because again, the question marks with him are always the deep stuff, and similar to Kamal Ishmael back in the day, like the closer he is to the line of scrimmage, the more effective he is in coverage. We saw that last preseason where both of his interceptions, I think, came within 8 yards of the line of scrimmage in last year's preseason. So I do think DeMarcco Hellams fits that prototype, but we'll sort of see, if he can sort of expand his horizons to be more than just a cover 3 safety, because it's not just exclusively cover 3 that this defense is going to use. They like to use cover 4 and cover 6, and they don't really use a lot of cover 2, but there will be some man coverage in there, cover 1, if you want to call it that. So we'll see how that goes. And my charting last year, when you're looking at Hellams and Grant in cover 3, Hellams was very effective when the Falcons increased their cover 3 usage after starting him after the bye week in week 12. He only gave up a 33% success rate when targeted in cover 3. Richie Grant combined over the last 2 years, giving up a 53% success rate, which is not good, but like not terrible either. For the sake of comparison, Jesse Bates was 56% last year when targeted against in cover 3, and Jalen Hawkins over the last 2 years was 67%. So we could do a lot worse than Richie Grant at this point in time. And so what's interesting about Grant is that he's been much more effective playing the cover 2 and cover 4 coverages, those sort of split safety or whatever you want to call it. Technically, it's not split safety because it's not, but like those quarters and cover 2, the middle of the field open coverages, his success rate when targeted in those coverages is about 34% combined over the last 2 years. So it seems like Richie Grant was a much more better fit for the non-cover 3 stuff based off of by charting the last couple of years. And we'll see if he can improve against the cover 3 in order to win that starting job, this year. And to me, it remains to be seen if DeMarcco Hellams can perform outside of cover 3. He wasn't really asked to do a whole lot outside of that last year. So when we talk about these two guys' breakout potential, it's a similar conversation where, you're, at least for Hellams, what I would consider a breakout for him is, he goes into next year as the uncontested starter opposite Jesse Bates. And for Richie Grant, because this is a contract year, a breakout year for him is that we get to January, the end of the season, and we're sitting here going like he's a priority re-signing, right? That would be, to me, the end result of breakout season. So we'll see who's going to break out. Again, I think Richie Grant is the more talented of the two. I think he's capable of doing more things, but that kind of arguably, and I've made this argument in the past, like I don't know if that makes him a better option to start I think that makes him a better option to be a dime safety, because that dime safety is probably going to be asked to do a lot of things, whether it's play deep, play those hook curls, play in the slot. Like Richie Grant can do a lot of those different skill sets that you would ideally want in a third safety. So you can kind of mix and match him wherever you need him. And Hellams is a little bit more limited, at least through, so far he's shown, and we'll see if he can expand and show that he's capable of doing more, and eager to see if he can prove me wrong in that front. But it could make a lot more sense if we're going to play a lot more cover three for Hellams to be the starter and Richie Grant to be that third safety, that plays, 20% of the snaps or whatever, that the Falcons would use dime defense. So it will be interesting to see what that battle winds up being but I think both of these guys are probably more bridge guys than necessarily long-term answers at the position. And we'll see if Falcons can, if those guys can outperform those expectations, and either one of those guys is coming back next year as the uncontested starter because of their performance this upcoming season, or will we have to, be dipping back into the free agent safety pool, or what is expected to be a better, stronger 2025 draft class at the safety position, at least based off of our April guest, Max Chadwick of PFF, when he was, looking ahead to the next year as part of some of his duties over there covering college football for Pro Football Focus. So those are my thoughts on the safety battle, and we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the breakout potential of another D lineman in Zach Harrison, who I think arguably has maybe the greatest breakout potential, at least of the guys that we're talking about today. And we'll get into all that as we finish and wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we're expecting a bigger role for Zach Harrison this upcoming season. Figuratively and literally, he has bulked up, according to Joe Patrick of 92.9 The Game, a report that came out a couple of weeks ago. We talked earlier this month, I think on a Q&A we did either last week or the week before, talked about Zach Harrison specifically. So go check out that episode if you haven't, check out, the everydayers know. But we talked about how, we went back and looked at the film down the stretch over those last couple of games that Zach Harrison played, and looked at what he was doing on film that led to him being much more productive, not only as a run defender and a pass rusher in the 3 out of those last 4 games of the season. And some of the key bullet points we discussed in that episode were he still needs to improve his snap timing because he's too consistently late off the ball. But when he does, get off the ball, his recognition was better. His hand usage was better. He was better at disengaging blocks. He was more effective using his power to, overwhelm offensive tackles and whatnot. And so we're hoping to see him pick up where he left off. We're expecting, at least I'm expecting, when I say we, the royal we, I'm expecting him to be one of the Falcons' primary early down guys. Like, of all these, I don't know what the rest of the rotation is going to look like, but I feel pretty confident projecting Zach Harrison to be, one of those D ends in their base 3-4 defense that's going to play a lot on first and second down. That's going to allow Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata to be fresher, so they get more opportunities on third downs, the bulk of those opportunities on third downs, to rush the quarterback on the interior. I don't know how much we're going to see Zach Harrison in a lot of these passing down situations. Obviously in pass downs, because again, I think Jared and Onyemata are better options right now. We'll see if Zach Harrison can make a leap there. But because of the limited pass rushing opportunities that he may have, it's hard to consider him a true breakout candidate. But I do think with an expanded role, he still can be a reliable contributor. The issue with Zach Harrison as a pass rusher is that he's a power rusher. And as we've discussed many times, not only talking about Zach Harrison a year ago, Braylon Trice this year, Tack McKinley in 2017, we've talked about this a number of times with these sort of power rushers, Ruka Rororo, et cetera. Power guys tend to be pressure guys, not sack artists, right? And we talked about it, how, it's due to the fact that, if you're bull rushing a guy, the offensive lineman's natural instincts is to clamp down on your hands as your hands are in his chest, and it's hard for you to then disengage to go and tackle the quarterback, right? We'll see if Zach Harrison can be more than that. I know he was a very technical pass rusher at Ohio State, but he doesn't quite have the bend or the burst, I think, that's going to be really that effective at the NFL level. I'm sure he can throw out a swipe move every now and then. We the player that I comped him to was Charles Omenihu. That's another guy that did that a lot in San Francisco. He's coming off a 7-sack season with the Kansas City Chiefs, that is. Omenihu, that is. But that's Omenihu in year 5. And I don't expect Zach Harrison to get to that level until a few years down the road. He's just in the second year of his NFL career. But I do think a realistic projection for what I'm hoping from Zach Harrison this year, we'll see if he lives up to this, is someone that can get you, maybe 4, maybe 5 sacks this upcoming season, potentially 30, 35 pressures, doing a lot to help collapse the pocket on those early downs, and being the team's third most skillful interior defensive lineman next to Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, and closing that gap between those. And so to me, a breakout year for Zach Harrison is kind of like if we get to a certain point in the season and we're like, he's starting to steal some of those passing down snaps from Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, in terms of showcasing that pass rushing ability, where it's like we can't take this guy off the field, and now we can kind of lighten the load a little bit for Grady and David Onyemata even further, because Zach can give those guys breathers on the 3rd and 5s and the 3rd and 7s and whatnot. That to me is what I would consider a breakout year for Zach Harrison, and we'll see if he winds up living up to that. But for that reason, that's why I sit here and I go he's probably the most likely of the guys to break out this year, just because I think the threshold is probably a little bit lower because he's part of a rotation, a corner, an outside corner like Clark Phillips, or a safety like Grant or Hellams. Those guys got to play every snap. And so there's a lot more, there's a lot higher standard for what a reliable starter when you're playing 100% or 98% of the snaps or whatever it is in those roles, versus with Zach Harrison, where it's like, hey, you just kind of have to play. If you can get to 45 or 50% of the snaps, you're doing great, right? And so that's why, I think he has probably the greatest potential to be the breakout. Not to mention he's probably the most skillful of these guys, just pound for pound relative to his position. I think he has much more of a more coveted skill set at D end than Grant or Hellams or Phillips have at corner and safety. So that's why I kind of consider Zach Harrison to be maybe have the most breakout potential. But we'll see. We'll see if he lives up to those expectations, and we'll see, what we're talking about with Zach Harrison going into year 3 and talking about him, potentially being maybe that more of that 7+ sack guy that Charles Omenihu has been, although Omenihu's doing that in a true 4-3 sort of defense. And we'll see, if Zach Harrison can get those same results playing more inside in a 3-4. So that will be an open question as well. So those are my thoughts on those 4 breakout candidates. And now I'm sitting here racking my brain, who else did I forget from the last couple of drafts? We did the 3 guys from 23. We did 2. I'm missing someone from 22, aren't I? That's what it is. There was a day 3 guy that I'm missing. Not D'Angelo Malone. Anyway, so y'all are yelling at your phones right now. It's this person, and I'm just I have no idea who that person is. Give me a second. It's D. Alford. That's through the power of editing, I realized it was D. Alford was the 10th guy that I was blanking on. And so I guess, as we've already discussed today, we believe in D. Alford. If I'm sitting here saying more so than Zach Harrison, he probably has the most breakout potential, just because I do think he's the strongest front runner to be a starter at that nickel cornerback position. And we've seen good moments from D. Alford. And again, if the measurement is he's going to be the uncontested nickel cornerback in 2025, I do think D. Alford probably has the best odds of anybody that we talked about, including Troy Andersen and Arnold Pichetti, to have a quote unquote breakout year. So we'll see. But there's always some reason why the Falcons, don't seem to want to give D. Alford that chance. I don't know. I don't quite get it. He's by no means a flawless corner, but he's been solid. He's been solid these last 2 years when he's played. So no complaints there for D. Alford. So that is who the last person is. So we've talked about all 10 guys. I guess we've talked about 9 of those 10 guys, because the 10th guy is going to be Brandon Dorless. We're not going to talk about D'Angelo Malone. I'm sorry, but if you want to have a debate about D'Angelo Malone in the comments, by all means do so. But we're not talking about him on the podcast. I mean, we will have a conversation at some point about the HLO later this summer before training camp, but we will not be devoting 5 to 10 minutes of the podcast talking about the HLO. So that is going to do it for us here, guys. We'll be back next week with a Falcons historian shootout with Brandon Dorless breakdown, as well as we'll see if we can rustle out some guests, because I know you guys are tired of my negativity. So let's bring some more positive people onto the podcast to balance things out. So that is what's in store for you guys next week. Make sure you have a great weekend. Check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and go ahead and check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft. They're already starting their summer scouting series. So you want to hear who are the top players at various positions. I know they did the offensive tackles the other day. And so if you're worried about Caleb McGarry or Jake Matthews replacement in the future, go check out Locked On NFL Draft for your second listen. So that's going to do it for us, guys. Appreciate it. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.